Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to this round table on artificial intelligence and international cooperation. My name is Nico and this is Reboot 2030, the Democracy School's YouTube channel and podcast. In this Reboot Special, we talk about the strengths and limitations of current AI, why AI might become a dangerous instrument of disinformation, and why superintelligent AI may be much closer than most people previously expected. In other words, why it may only be years rather than decades away. Leading on from that, we argue that this motivates the need for international cooperation and to avoid, for example, catastrophic risks arising from AI arms races or indeed from economic races driven by a similar self-destructive game theoretical competition. With me today are Yoshua Bengio, Professor of Learning Algorithms and Artificial Intelligence in the Department of Computing and Operations Research at the University of Montreal, and John Bunzl, Founder and Trustee of the International Simultaneous Policy Organisation, or SIMPOL for short. Let me invite the two in. Hello, good morning and good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining me today. I have already very briefly introduced you, so let's jump straight in. Joshua, thank you ever so much for being here today. It's a great privilege, and you have been in the news a lot. You have been quite vocal about the risks of current artificial intelligence. Now, it's interesting when I hear somebody like you coming out quite, with warning signs of the type that you've come out with. It kind of, in a way, reminds me of Albert Einstein. He was, of course, a very gifted scientist who was involved in the first atomic bomb, and once it was there, he became a great critic of nuclear arms. And there's a sort of a poetic similarity here. You've been really one of the very early pioneers of artificial intelligence, and here you are sort of sounding a warning signs. Joshua, what do you think are the kind of the real risks that you see emerge in the absence of adequate regulation? Could you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. Well, in summary, there's a whole continuum of risks, and there's a lot about the scenarios that could turn bad that we don't understand and that have a lot of uncertainty attached to them, which also explains why there's a lot of divergence in the AI scientific community about these questions. So let me try to break down different kinds of catastrophic scenarios, because this is where the international community really needs to be present. Because they're like sort of simpler harms. Okay, so first is, and easiest to understand, is misuse, where humans, some organizations, some people intentionally use very powerful AI, which doesn't even need to be superhuman, in order to achieve something very dangerous. So once we have AI systems that can be, say, comparable or better than us in terms of cyber security, for example, you can immediately see that they're like huge dangers. But there are other areas that I've been worried about, and others too. I've been working for the last few years a lot on biotechnology. I mean, AI for biotechnology, and it's very clear to me that this is a very, very dangerous area, because we're making progress in understanding how we can change the DNA of microorganisms so that they would do something that we want, but that can easily be turned into something dangerous. And for now, we don't yet, have enough understanding of that. Biologists only have partial views, but it could change quickly in the coming years, and AI is going to help us in that respect. And a lot of the data is publicly online. It's very easy to order pathogens. I mean, they may not look like pathogens, but yeast or bacteria, and order variants of them that have DNA changed in any way you want. And the companies who will do that will not know what that change means. So that's bioweapons. And then people have been also talking about chemical weapons. Again, we're using AI to design new drugs, for example. I've been involved in this, but it's easy to change the objective into something nefarious. So then I'll explain later like how an AI could potentially get access to all this. But for now, these are examples where, again, going back to what I'm saying, we're talking about humans intentionally using powerful AI systems as essentially as a weapon.
Yoshi, let's backtrack a little bit. Let's backtrack a little bit, because I have a sense that many of our viewers or listeners have not really a very clear idea in mind what AI actually is today. I think it's a highly mythologized term. And I instantly think of, science fiction. I think of some virtual brain kind of talking back to me out of cyberspace. What is the current state of AI? What is it, what can it do today, realistically? And what is the trajectory? I mean, how would you see it develop over the next?
Sure, I can answer that.
Also, I guess there's different forms of AI. I mean, when people now talk about AI, they presumably talk about large language models, I think, because ChatGPT has been so dominant in public discourse. I think that's what most people have in mind.
Large deep nets. Large deep nets, because you also have models of images, both for recognition and for synthesis, speech, like sounds, music, both, and recognition. So we now have machines that can perceive the world and make sense of it with images and sounds, and can also generate content, images, sounds, and texts. So all of these systems are based on deep learning, which is inspired by how the brain works. And you got like hundreds of billions of connections between artificial neurons, or even a trillion probably in GPT-4. So these are huge systems, and their training is extremely expensive right now, but the cost is decreasing quickly. And once you have trained a system that essentially builds an understanding of the environment in which it's trained, like the kind of data. So if it's text, it will understand the world through that angle. If it's text and images, it will understand both these modalities. But you could have video and text. So then it understands all three: sounds and images and text. So these systems, once they're trained with, which takes months and tens of millions of dollars, they can be tuned for specific tasks. And that's how like the dialogue systems like ChatGPT have been designed. And it doesn't take that much time, that much money, and that much data, which means that second part is fairly easy once you have access to the pre-trained model, which is like a huge file, but not so big. So for example, when Facebook is sharing the weights of their large language models, I think they're playing with fire. Now, the current systems are not yet at the level of human intelligence in many ways, but most importantly, the general agreement, let's say, is they master what psychologists call system one intelligence, and that's essentially intuition, like your reactive answer to any context and question without really going through an internal thinking step. And so they're not that great in terms of reasoning tasks, but they can do some reasoning, like, you don't need to think through for things you're familiar with. It looks like you're reasoning, but you've learned to combine pieces of evidence in order to come up with answers. But system two is where you have explicit reasoning, and that allows us to generalize in new contexts better than machines right now, to imagine things in order to help us plan and things like that. So there's still a gap.
Could I ask you to give me an example, a decision challenge where, you know, the kind of AI 0.1 and AI 2.0 that you've just described, right, how they differ? Give us a simple decision problem and show the difference.
Right. So right now, if you give an AI a few simple rules, like some arithmetic rules, in fact, it already knows them because it has read a lot about it on the internet. If you ask it to do simple operations with numbers, it will get them right. But if you start asking complicated operations of the kind that you and I would need paper and pencil, or a very good ability to visualize things, but clearly using our thinking process, it wouldn't do that great, and it would make mistakes. And then if you ask it to explain its wrong answers or even the right answer, it tends to give a wrong explanation. So when you have a chain of like thoughts that are necessary for us humans to solve the problem, and it's a new chain, so it's not something it has seen, then it will tend to make more mistakes. Sometimes it'll be okay, sometimes not. So that's an example of reasoning. But there are other things, like an example I gave in my talk, which is they will need a lot more data to adapt to a new situation, whereas we can use our thinking to kind of train ourselves in our mind. So the example I use is, if you've been driving all your life in North America, driving on the right side of the road, then you go to Australia or London and you have to drive on the left side, it's going to take humans, you know, an hour of driving, more or less, to kind of get it right. And in that hour, they will survive because they will be thinking very carefully about each move, right? Which means you don't go with your intuition default behavior. You have some part of your brain that's checking, oh, no, you need to go this way, or you need to anticipate other cars, you know, because the rules are different. And it's just one rule that's changed, but we can, like, very quickly, even in our mind, we can do a lot of the training to get better at it to some extent. And athletes, for example, do that. Anyways, so there are a number of these abilities that are still missing, but the concern I have and others have is that we don't know how much time it's going to take to bridge that gap. I've been working on this problem, the System 2 problem, for like 6 years, and we could be very close to a breakthrough. It's very plausible. Or it could take another 10 or 20 years. I don't know. There's, like, science is unpredictable in these things.
There's
but
one
we're
aspect,
understanding enough that it could be pretty close anytime now.
There's one aspect which I would like our viewers to understand a little bit better, and that's, you sort of say the AI needs to be trained on data.
Yes.
Again, there's this kind of idea, almost like a muscle sort of thing, you know, like training, like going to the gym.
Just like us.
Yeah, but the thing is, of course, is that data has inherent biases. So we're not only training the data in a kind of Aristotelian kind of way of pure thought, but we're training data on a very realistic set of, you know, and it includes anything from homophobic kind of data to racist data to, you know, kind of populist, nationalist data, and so on and so forth. So I guess part of the process of training is also cleaning the data, isn't it? So that the data that actually is then used for the training is
actually done by humans. I mean, writing specialized scripts and asking labelers, like cheap labor, to kind of identify cases of, you know, racism or things like that, or insulting behavior or whatever. Or providing information that could be dangerous, like, you know, how to build a bomb.
Yeah, and so my
right
question
now
is, my question is if we were to kind of jump to super intelligent AI, would the AI then be able to iron out these biases itself, or in your thinking, or would it just sort of turbocharge these biases? Where, you know, what's the?
Well, it depends It depends. It depends what kind of approach you take to bridging that gap. The approach I'm working on, or have been, wouldn't hopefully have this problem, because instead of trying to imitate how humans behave, it would try to understand why they behave that way. It would build a causal model, just like we do, by the way. So it's not because I hear somebody say something like outrageous that I suddenly believe it, right? I take into context that it's this person saying it, or sometimes humans lie or have intentions to deceive or whatever, or simply wrong. And so, yeah, I think it's quite possible that we could fix this, and I think it will be necessary actually to fix this in order to build systems that actually understand how the world works, and that's where they get most dangerous, right? So we'll fix the bias problem, but we'll now have machines that are like at least as smart as us. And by the way, there's an interesting thing that has been explained nicely by my colleague and like co-award winner Jeff Hinton in a recent talk. Once we have machines that are as smart as us, in the sense, once we have machines that embody the principles like system 1 and system 2 that essentially give us our cognitive abilities, we'll automatically have machines that are smarter than us. And that's because these programs are running on digital computers, and we are running on biological analog hardware. And there are to try to make images to understand the difference. For example, these machines are essentially immortal. They can copy themselves into other computers. If your body fails, your brain dies, you're done. These machines don't have those limitations. Also, they can exchange information between each other at a rate like billions of times greater than us. We are limited by language, a few bits per second, and they can have, huge bandwidth capacities, meaning they can synchronize each other almost if it was one big brain, right? Which we can't. We have culture to try to approximate that, but we can't do that.
Let me ask a sort of a further question here. You've kind of mentioned words like they will be super smart and super intelligent, more smarter than us and more intelligent than us. Now, would it be smart or intelligent to hit that kind of nuclear button in a kind of mutually assured destructive scenario? In other words, if these machines really were smarter than us, could that not also kind of usher in a period of paradise and of like rational thinking, actually in a way kind of making up for all our human frailties and shortfalls? Or when you say smarter, do you mean more evil than us? What exactly do you mean by smarter?
It's a great question. Let me answer. There are two separate things that are joined together in humans, but not in machines. And so one thing is pure intellectual power, like understanding and then being able to infer what you should do or how to get to a place, or, in order to achieve some goals. So that's just intellectual power. And it's completely detached from what the goals are. We can't turn off our compassion instinct. It's been hardwired into us, at least most of us, by evolution. For machines, it's just a few lines of code, right? And even a human operator, if you think about, if you've been using ChatGPT, you can ask it questions and you could tell it to do it in a particular way. So you're actually giving it a kind of goal. And so if the goals are nefarious, then it will be an evil machine, if you want. If the goals are to protect humanity and help, fight disease and climate change, it should be great. However, there's another problem, which is very complicated. It's called the alignment problem. It's well known in economics. There was a recent Nobel Prize about it. And even if we give it what we think are good goals, it may still misbehave. And it has to do with the fact that it's almost impossible to state what we want in a compact way. It's like the 3 wishes of genies, right? You think you ask for something good and you end up with something that could be harmful.
Now, one last question. That's very, very interesting. So what you're saying is that because AI systems are always partial, as in they have specific goals as opposed to universal goals.
Well, there's no such thing as universal goals.
No,
like,
right.
You
right.
have goals, I have goals, and we don't even know what our goals are. Like we think we can express them, but it's only like a partial specification.
Well, if I would specify, assure world peace at all times, then that would be a universal goal. Or if I would,
no, but you didn't say that humans have to, survive the peace. You can have peace with everybody's dead, right? And then you say, okay, add this clause, and I'll find another one where it's going to be bad for us. It's a never-ending problem. And by the way, this is kind of what some of the current systems are built. They try to put down some specification of what we want the system, how this system should behave, and then they try it out, and then they find some problems, and they add some more pieces.
And of course, the problem here, Joshua, if I understand you correctly, is that if we now place that huge power in sort of like, say, two polarized hands, one in the east, one in the west, or one in the north, or one in the south, or however we split up the planet, we may find ourselves in another sort of game theoretical, self-destructive loop. Isn't that what you're saying? And it's then going to be a question of whose AI is bigger, stronger, more powerful, and that's going to be the game then. Isn't that what you're kind of
but there are other dangerous games. So that's the AI arms race scenario. But there are other games where it's not even that countries are trying to dominate each other. So first of all, companies can try to dominate each other, and they will, because of the commercial incentive and the survival pressure on them, they might not be always very careful. And if you're not careful with these very powerful systems that eventually will be smarter than us, you might end up in a situation where what we call loss of control. So I need to explain that concept. What does that mean? Even if you give goals to the machine, so I said that there may be a mismatch between how it behaves and what we intended. A kind of side effect of having a goal is that the machine will create sub-goals implicitly or explicitly in order to achieve those goals. So the sub-goal that's most common, sort of a side effect of almost any goal, is survive. In other words, to achieve my goal, I need to still be there to carry it to the end.
Yeah.
So now I have this extra goal, which means I don't want humans to turn me off. And if you remember or have seen Space Odyssey 2001 and the HAL 9000 story, that's exactly what happens. Once the machine kind of gets paranoid that, oh, maybe somebody wants to turn me off, they're going to potentially, they get into a conflict with humans, which ended badly in the story, of course.
And you're saying, to me, this sounds like pure science fiction. It's a perfect
no, it's not.
Plot,
it's computer science. It's not science fiction. It's peer-reviewed computer science and economics. Behind the game theoretical issue, if you want.
But how? And at this point, I want to start to think about bringing John in on the conversation, who has built an organization around this idea to countering what he calls global sort of destructive competition. And he gives examples of first mover disadvantages that kind of trigger a kind of a race to the bottom, similar to what, for instance, an arms race would be, or indeed kind of an economic race of sorts. Now, if you take, for example, the Cold War arms race, nuclear arms race, regulating this was not easy, but it wasn't easy because of the power play. The actual specification of what needs regulating was actually quite straightforward. In UK, so basically only build so many nuclear warheads, only do this and the other. It was quantifiable in a way that you didn't have to have a PhD in computing to understand. Now, what you said is saying is that we're looking at an unbounded problem which can shoot off in so many directions. How would you ever regulate this?
Wow, I've been thinking a lot about that. I'm a computer scientist. I'm not like a legal expert. But there are many things we can do to reduce the probability of catastrophes. So the most important one is think of who has access to nuclear bombs. So who has access to very powerful AI systems? We want to limit that number. We want to make sure that, say, companies that have these systems don't share the code and the model parameters so that anybody out there can derive something dangerous from it.
So in that sense, it's similar to warheads. We really are saying, these server farms and what's basically in them, they need to be protected in the same way as a kind of like a silo with a nuclear warhead would have had to be protected.
Yeah, you need licensing that's going to be very strict, both for people and for organizations that build these things. And you need rules to make sure that there's no leaks. I mean, and eventually there will be, but at least you minimize the probabilities of those things. So that's the access part. Then you have the problem of alignment. So I try to explain, difference between intention and what you get. And that requires a lot more investment in research. So it's not regulation, but it's like, research on climate. If you're dealing with climate change, we need to understand better what can go wrong. And we are starting to understand that. So we know some things are more dangerous than others. So regulation, so for example, AI systems that have agency that can act in the world, for example, on the internet, are much more dangerous than AI systems that don't have even a notion of themselves acting in the world. And that you can build systems that are like that. So they're more like tools rather than agents, and they're much safer. So there are various considerations like this that can already go into regulation if we were to do it tomorrow morning, that have to do with that mismatch between what we want and what we get. The third aspect where regulation comes in is this intellectual power, right? So more intelligent systems are more dangerous, but for example, you can have specialized systems that are very intelligent about biology or even a particular disease, and they're probably not very dangerous. Like they don't understand human psychology or how the world works or how to hire people to do things or what's organized crime. So they're much less dangerous. So there are many factors here in that can be controlled. So some systems again are more dangerous than others. The amount of compute that you need to train them also is a factor. So we want to make sure if somebody, you need a license to buy more than 10,000 GPUs, for example, or something like this, and you want to track who these people are and making sure they follow the rules. So the type of data, the amount of data that they use. So all of these can be factors that can be managed so that we reduce those risks. And then finally, the agency I mentioned. So is it, what's the action space? Like, so if an AI is actually controlling nuclear weapons, like that's the worst scenario because it can directly create something really dangerous. But if it's far removed from potentially very harmful actions, then it's easier. If it doesn't have access to the internet, but it's kind of only interacting with humans, for example, then it has less of a potential for harm. But of course, it can convince people. So it's not a perfect, isolation. But you can see that different degrees of potentially harmful agency that can also be regulated.
Absolutely. And of course, I guess what you're saying is that this all has to operate within a dynamic frame of knowledge creation and reflection. So as we move forward, obviously, and more understanding emerges, more knowledge emerges, we need to
build regulatory frameworks, both national and international, that are going to be highly adaptive, because there's still a lot of things we don't understand. We're going to be doing research, and then some, people are going to be playing with those systems and being careless or, malicious, and we're going to figure out, we need to have a new regulation to deal with that. And we're not going to have like 3 years to react. It's going to have to be very quick, because you can have threats on democracy, for example, in coming elections. That's very plausible. So it needs to be that in a matter of weeks, an organization like this can react and say, this this is not allowed anymore.
Absolutely. Joshua, what I'd like to do is I'd like to bring John in now and tell us a little bit about the organization he founded in 2000, SIMPOL, to understand what, first of all, to understand what SIMPOL is doing, how they operate, and what I would then like to do following that is to sort of experimentally, just us to knock our heads together a bit and see whether such an organization could play a role in moving forward some kind of regulatory debate. John, over to you. Thank you very much for coming in today as well, and for all your patience. We've slightly overrun, but this has been so interesting listening to Joshua about AI that I was very happy to let it run. John, please do tell us a little bit more about SIMPOL, what its objectives are, and how it actually works.
Thank you, Nico. Thanks for inviting me. Nice to meet you, Yoshua. Yeah, basically, SIMPOL is a framework for international cooperation, for widespread international cooperation, and it's born out of the realization that we basically are living in a globalized economy where information, money, capital, investment moves at the click of a computer mouse across national borders. And yet our governance systems are primarily national, okay? And so there is a mismatch, there's a governance gap. And in a the economy, economic markets always move ahead of governance. Governance is always trying to play catch up with economic innovation and development. And we're now at a stage where there's a whole raft of problems that fall into this category of first mover competitive disadvantage, these game theoretical issues where, we can talk about, for example, with AI, you can talk about the threats, but then when you overlay on that the international aspects that China is trying to get ahead of the States and vice versa, and it's a race to the bottom, as you just said. And what I'm trying to enliven people to is that there's a whole raft of these issues now, and we need a comprehensive framework to deal with all of them. And that's what SIMPOL tries to outline and to put into practice. Now, before I start, let me just say that I think I do agree with Yoshua. I think that the problem of AI is so urgent that I don't think it can wait for SIMPOL, right? I think there probably needs to be something done much more quickly on that. However, I think that the point that I want to get across to people is that we have to wake up that there is a whole raft of these issues. There is AI, there is climate change, there is nuclear weapons, there is financial market regulation, there is the way the banks create money out of nothing. There are 20 really
taxation.
Huge. Sorry?
Taxation.
Yeah, and corporate tax avoidance, tax evasion, all of these things. There's a whole raft of issues, and in fact, what is the lack of governance in that space is that the poison from that lack of governance trickles down to the national level, the local level. If we don't fix the global level, everything is going to collapse. And so, but as I said, I think AI is so urgent, it may well need, and it may well galvanize something much more quickly. So it may not be that relevant to SIMPOL. Nevertheless, let me explain what SIMPOL is based on. So the SIMPOL is actually short for simultaneous policy. The idea is that if all or sufficient nations act together simultaneously, then no nation loses out. Corporations have nowhere to run. You get global coverage, but you don't need a global government. You just need very coordinated international cooperation with simultaneous implementation. So that's the first point. The second point is that SIMPOL would be based on a multi-issue agreements. I think one of the problems we have today, for example, with climate change, is that we're just trying to deal with one issue at a time. If you take any single issue, you will always get some nations that win on that issue, other nations that lose on that issue, and the losers, of course, have no incentive to cooperate. But if you had a multi-issue package, you have the opportunity for trade-offs. So just very, you know, and I acknowledge this is far easier said than done, but if, for example, nations were to agree a currency transactions tax, a global currency transactions tax, simultaneously implemented, this is not a new idea, it's been around for, it's called, sometimes called a Tobin tax. The proceeds from that tax, or some of the proceeds from that tax, could be used to compensate the loser nations on a climate agreement. So the idea is to make it in every nation's self-interest to cooperate, if you understand what I'm saying. Now, the third aspect of SIMPOL is the most unique, and that is the bottom-up aspect, where you know, it's all very well talking about nations making a simultaneous agreement, but how are we going to drive them to get there? And that's where citizens come in. So SIMPOL is actually an association of citizens who basically declare that they will give strong preference at all future national elections to politicians who've signed a pledge to implement the simultaneous policy. Okay, so we are basically saying, you know, we may or may not have a party preference, but we are going to give preference to politicians who sign the pledge. Doesn't matter what party. And that declaration means that we don't need a majority of citizens to drive politicians to sign that pledge, because, you know, many parliamentary seats and even entire elections are won and lost on relatively fine margins. And so to date, we actually have over 100 members of parliament of the UK Parliament who've signed the pledge. They come from all the main UK parties. In Germany, I think we've got about 40 members of the Deutsche Bundestag who've signed. In the Irish Parliament, about 12 or 15. And then we have a few members of parliament in other parliaments around the world who've signed up. So this is really a way that citizens can drive the political process in different nation states towards this goal. And that ability to incentivize politicians also means that citizens can have a very strong influence over the policies that are to be contained within SIMPOL, right? So this isn't a matter of leaving it up to governments to, with their corporate influences to decide. We citizens can have a very powerful influence because ultimately they depend on our votes, right? Now, obviously, the first question that arises, okay, well, that's fine for democratic countries, but what about China? What about non-democratic countries? So my suggestion there is that the SIMPOL framework, as I've described it, means that for any nation, they've got nothing to lose by participating in the process and everything to gain. And non-democratic countries need solutions to global problems too. So I think, you know, the absence of this governance framework means that the crisis level is going to keep rising and rising and rising, so that whether you're a democratic country or a non-democratic country, sooner or later, the incentive to cooperate to solve the problem is going to be absolutely sort of irresistible, because the alternative will be, you know, that we all go under. So there's now, of course, no guarantees to this. And anyone who expects guarantees really is a bit naive and ought to grow up, I would say. But so what SIMPOL is trying to do is to enliven people to this need for a cooperative framework to deal with all of these kind of issues. Because, you know, they keep popping up, and they will continue to pop up all the while that this framework is not in place. Now, I've been at this for 20 years, Nico, and you and I, we've spoken about this before. And the biggest barrier to this, I mean, the big paradox with SIMPOL is actually politicians are much more supportive of SIMPOL than citizens are, funnily enough. But I think that's because politicians understand the dilemma that they're in. much more than citizens do or NGOs. But my hope is that, with time and through channels like yours, we will enliven citizens to this need. And SIMPOL is a very good tool for driving this process up the political agenda, driving politicians to sign up, and eventually moving towards a series of multi-issue cooperative simultaneous policies implemented simultaneously. So it sounds like a utopian idea, but what I say to people is it's not utopian. If you think it's utopian, it's just because your thinking is still lagging behind the reality. The problems, exactly as Yoshua has described, are right here, right now. So if you still think this kind of thing is utopian, it's you that needs to catch up. Anyhow, so that's it in a nutshell. As I say, I think AI is from what I understand, Yoshua, mainly from listening to you now, but also in some previous videos I've seen. It's probably so urgent that it needs its own more immediate agreement. But I really hope that that also people will not forget that there's a whole load of issues out there that need this kind of SIMPOL framework.
So the timeline is complicated because there's a lot of uncertainty about it. As I mentioned, it could be that we bridge that gap in just a few years, let's say 3 to 5 years, or it could be it's going to take 2 decades. And that's just my opinion. Other scientists have a different opinion. But there's the kind of numbers I give here, a lot of people think are reasonable. A lot of people who are experts. But nonetheless, there's a big gap between, say, 4 and 20. And so you end up with having to jointly prepare for all of those cases. It's difficult. Governments don't move very quickly. And they have, climate in a way is easier because we have physics models that, how things could, to project ourselves in the future. Whereas for AI, we can't run simulations of entities smarter than us.
Well, yes, in some sense, though, that might be an advantage, Yoshua, because I think, in a certain sense, like Nico was saying earlier, it's kind of like science fiction, and that scares people. And so that
it could also be dangerous.
Uncertainty may actually be a benefit for spurring quicker cooperation.
Maybe. There are people who are also afraid of an AI panic, which could, bring to power authoritarian governments. That we have to be very careful. I had a question for you, John. So I like the ideas of SIMPOL. I think something like this is needed, but I wonder what your thoughts are about even if you get a lot of parliamentaries on board, they might still have different opinions about what we should do about the problem. And you talk about, international cooperation and negotiation. Well, can you elaborate on that? Because there will be divergences, and in AI there already are, even among the scientists, not to mention the politicians.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe AI can help us. But if you go onto our website, there's an information pack which gives a more of a breakdown of the sort of process of policy development that we would envisage. And I'm not an expert, but I would envisage that, for AI, for climate, for financial markets, you would have groups of experts that would advise SIMPOL supporters as to, you yourself just outlined some headlines for how, what one might do to regulate AI. And gradually we could incorporate that into our, you see, at the moment, if you go onto our website, we list just a list of issues like climate, AI, blah, blah, blah. But gradually, as time goes on and our support grows, we would gradually define what would be required in each of those areas.
Right.
and deliberate.
But that may be a place where the different parliamentarians might kind of disagree, right? So you have to engage into a process of agreeing on something.
Well, yeah, we would, and obviously, you know, there will be divergences, and I mean, the short answer is, Yoshua, I don't know the answer to your question. What I do know is that as the water level, you know, the pressure gets higher and higher, the pressure for agreement gets higher and higher.
That's right.
You know, and, I mean, and in a way, that's how cooperation has always worked.
Yeah, but maybe if I briefly come in here, I mean, I think there are quite, there's a lot of experience on how to design participatory processes for complex sort of multi-governance decisions. I mean, I mean, for example, within the context of constitutional conventions, but also in other areas. So my sense would be that what you would have to do to make this work is almost put a rough first draft which would come from a leader like the US or, you know, whatever. And that would have sort of debating points along the way where you could almost like a menu where you could then kind of fine tune, and you could, in a modular way, you could replace or add different components to that. I think that's the process. So, because I think what, in my understanding of SIMPOL, what SIMPOL really works well for is the point when you actually come to a decision. I think the lead up to the decision, whether this is actually developed collaboratively within a SIMPOL framework, or whether this is put forward by, say, for example, the US or another kind of AI leader as a proposal to SIMPOL, and then other governments, other nations come on board and say, yeah, we would like to kind of have a say in that process. I think that's probably how I would see this work.
Yeah, yes, exactly. I mean, what you will see in the information pack is just our outline proposal of how a policy development process could work. But it's not written in stone. And as you say, Nico, there could be all sorts of other, you know, this has to be a collaborative effort. But you know, one thing, for example, that we would love to do would be to actually get a proper university study done on the, you know, the feasibility of bringing together a robust climate agreement and a currency transactions tax. You know, to see, you know, well, how high would the tax need to be in order to produce sufficient funds to compensate people on nations on the climate part of the agreement? What could be 2 or 3 different distribution scenarios of those funds, and so forth? And then I think, you know, one could work towards a SIMPOL 1, you know, an initial agreement that deals with urgent problems, but also proves the process. And I think if that is successful, then people will see the value in it, and then say, oh, wow, what else can we do with this? You know, oh yeah, we could, you know, what other policies could we pair up together? Or there might be two or more policies to produce package number 2, package number 3, which could also incorporate amendments to previous packages, because obviously, you know, there can be unintended consequences. There needs to be a rolling process of continuous improvement and sort of repair and innovation and so on. And as Yoshua says, you know, technology is moving all the time. So in some cases, there might need to be, you know, a series of AI SIMPOLs, you know, that keep up with the technological developments as they move. But again, you know, my main purpose, you know, I'm just really a businessman who had a crazy idea. I'm not an expert on any of this. My purpose really is to lay out the framework. You know, it's how do you make it in the self-interest of nations to cooperate? That's what SIMPOL does. How do you align the global interest with the national interest? How do you
John, there's
those onto each other? And how do you allow citizens to drive that process by using established democratic processes? And SIMPOL ticks all of those boxes. We've proved it works. You know, in a number of elections, we've had an experience where, particularly in tightly contested seats, parliamentary seats, once one candidate signs the pledge, the others are kind of forced to follow, right? So there's a kind of domino effect. So we end up with all the competing candidates having signed the pledge, even though the election only takes place in 2 weeks' time. So whoever wins, we win. So it's a completely new way of doing politics at the global level, and it doesn't stop you from necessarily from voting for your preferred party. So it's a bit like having 2 votes, because you make your declaration of giving preference to politicians that sign the pledge. That operates in advance of the election, right? And that drives politicians to pledge in advance of the election. But then on election day, you get your vote like everybody else. So you're kind of getting a global vote and a national vote rolled into one. Okay.
What's interesting, John, if you compare, like, say, the climate, global sort of climate issue with the AI, is what you will find is that on the climate side, there's a lot of arguments that say really most countries or all countries should be involved in the decision, because if they're not actually causing climate change, they'll be at the receiving end. With AI, I think it's somewhat different. If you had the sort of the G20 involved to agree thus, the rest of the nations would not have the economic or the kind of science base to actually ever produce like an AI that would be dangerous. So
it's the same countries are causing the problem that could also fix it in the case of AI. But there are all these countries that would get harm as well if the rich ones don't get their act together.
That's right. That's right. But they would be beneficiaries of a deal. But it's a bit like, the nuclear arms deal. There was no reason to rope in Nigeria because, nobody really ever thought that they would have a nuclear weapon.
In fact, mostly we need the US and China.
That's right. And possibly Europe.
So that's why in SIMPOL we say all or sufficient nations. And the word sufficient depends on the policy package. For nuclear weapons, for example, it might just be those nations that have them or are suspected of having them. For corporate tax evasion, it might need to be virtually all countries. So it depends. So it's flexible. This is a flexible thing. It depends on the policy that we're talking about, or the package of policies that we're talking about. But I think also that's this idea that there are some nations that will win on a particular policy and others that lose. That's why we need to bring 2 or more issues together so that we can create the possibility for trade-offs. Because if you don't have that, you get what we're getting with climate change, which is like COP 350, where we're still blathering on about it and nothing's really getting done.
Yeah, but Nick, actually, if the cost of computing continues to decrease, it could be like in 5 or 10 years that it becomes affordable for almost any country to enter into that race. And so
but you could obviously could guard with that, but basically kind of lowering the point at which, like, say, like GDP per head or whatever you would see as a level at which they would have to join the agreement if they want to stay part of the international community. I mean, you could, in a way, have a sort of a way of structuring it that they only have to come under the umbrella if they reach a certain kind of level of economic development. But no, you're right, of course, that over time the risk increases. I mean, it's a bit like with proliferation of arms. I mean, over time, you really do have to worry about many kind of rogue states of obtaining nuclear arms. Maybe 20 years ago, that wasn't so much of an issue. And absolutely, I think there is that. But in terms of,
I think in many cases, Nick, you will have a situation where, at first glance, many countries will be irrelevant to the agreement. However, I think it's important that they sign up, or it could be important that they sign up, even just to, say, well, if it happens, we're subject to it. And also so that a corporation knows that it can't just move to that country to avoid the regulation. So, whichever way you look at it, and this is what I'm trying to say to people, whichever way you try and dice and slice this, we need global cooperation, and there's no getting around it. So And I say again, we don't, God forbid, we don't want a world government, and but something like SIMPOL would be, as far as I can see, the perfect way to get that global coverage without without having this sort of huge bureaucracy of a world government. And also, let me also say that there's a very specific criteria for how a policy qualifies for inclusion in SIMPOL or not. And so to any policy proposal, we apply a test, and that test is, would the unilateral implementation of that policy by a single nation or by a restricted group of nations like the EU be likely to cause it a significant competitive disadvantage, yes or no? Now, if the answer to that is no, it wouldn't cause it a disadvantage, then it's a national policy, has nothing to do with SIMPOL. Okay, so that enforces and safeguards the principle of national sovereignty. Okay, but for where the answer is yes, it would cause a competitive disadvantage, then it falls into the SIMPOL category.
And in the case of AI, it would.
So in a sense, it's an extension of national sovereignty, because it's bringing collectively to nation states the power to deal with issues which they cannot deal with today.
Yeah.
I mean,
so in case of AI, innovation is the sort of the benefit of not putting regulation or reducing it.
There's an interesting example in the European Union and the common market. I mean, it was very hard to actually kind of get it going in the first place. But once it existed, everybody wanted to be a part of it, because it was except maybe now for the UK, but I mean, I think there's plenty in the UK who regret it too that they've left. But everybody else, I don't think, wants to actually leave the common market, because it's a massive advantage to be part of it and people can see it. And I think if, for example, if there was an agreement, a regulatory framework that would include an element of, knowledge transfer, technology sharing or whatever, smaller countries who would be at risk of becoming rogue states would have a great interest, because they would gain access to that technology by coming under the umbrella. So I think one could structure it in such a way that it sucks in smaller countries who would massively benefit at that point to being part of it. If you would get, as you said initially, like the US and China on the table to have the initial agreement, everything else I think would follow probably from there.
Yeah.
Now, the one thing, I think one of the big disadvantages, one of the big problems SIMPOL faces is that it's an abstract idea that doesn't really get people so excited. Another example is proportional representation. I mean, there's been, in the UK, people have been kind of campaigning for this for years. You've never won an election on it. Of course, it would be of great benefit to many smaller parties and all the rest, but it's abstract. Voters aren't motivated by that. And I think SIMPOL has a similar abstract problem. So, but if it was linked to an actual issue like AI, it could come to life. And so my question is it's chicken and egg, isn't it? It's like, I mean, John is convinced that this needs to grow to a certain size before it can become operational. I kind of wonder whether by kind of, if you like, sort of front loading it, like through a strategic exercise, a smaller, like a proof of concept initiative, whether this could light up people's imagination of what this kind of framework could do, not just for AI, but possibly also for other similar, again, theoretical kind of problems. How do you see that, Joshua? Do you think there's something in that, or how would you, having listened to John, how would you square that circle?
It makes sense to me, but I'm just a computer scientist, so it sounds right. I think that the scale of damage in the case of AI might be the thing that can bring, countries to the table, like even countries that are in strong opposition, just like after the Second World War, the fear of Armageddon, nuclear Armageddon, brought people to the table. So that might be something that can accelerate the process of bringing more countries to the table. Because the gains, are clear, but if we lose everything, then it's not a good game.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, what in practical terms are you doing to drive the AI regulation forward? I mean, I understand.
So
I think there was a letter
that
many people signed, wasn't there?
Yeah. So yeah, well, but there are discussions going on right now and taking place around the world, in different countries. So I'm going to be, in principle, in Washington, witnessing to the Senate about AI risks and regulation next week, and there are international discussions going on right now, various groups proposing international institutions to try to, create that cooperation and the funding for the research that's needed, because that's a big part of the problem. Like, there's a lot of unknown that we need to invest. Basically, for each dollar that we're currently investing in making AI smarter, we need at least the same amount to make it safer. And right now, it's like 100 to 1.
Joshua, what I'm thinking is like, you just mentioned that there needs to be an institution that deals with this. And I'm being a very practical kind of person. I'm thinking, well, here we have got SIMPOL, which is quite generic in terms of what it can do. It's almost like a white label service offering. You could, and it comes with quite a significant political backing already, hundreds of parliamentarians around the world. Now,
over 100, not hundreds.
well, 100 in the UK, 40 in Germany, and a couple of sprinkled around the world. But it's a lot more than nothing. And it also is an idea that has matured over the last 20 years. I wonder. This is just a kind of a thought. If this was used as a white label product, if you like, instead of say, well, okay, why don't we use that and build an institution around that to see whether it works? What would speak against that?
Well, you need to get the US and China first to agree. But actually, I think what's going to happen is more like G7 or the OECD, like democratic countries, are going to be able to sit together and come up with some agreements. But that's the place where something like SIMPOL could play. Then we need to get China around the table. So I already part of discussions to try to bring Chinese and
do you think,
Western
Yoshua,
people to kind of discuss these questions. It's just the discussion is just starting, right? But it's going to take a while.
Do you think that there might be some value in having something like SIMPOL, which isn't attached to any nation state? So it's a neutral third party, as it were, a kind of broker between the parties, or like Nico says, a white label. Because I think almost anything that comes from the G7 or from China or from any nation state is sort of almost automatically tainted by the hidden hand of national self-interest,
Yeah, but SIMPOL is based on, it works around the democracies, and right now, if I understand, it's just a very small number of countries, and not the US, right? So I think the US is the biggest thing. So we need, for this to work somehow jointly, we need to get something like SIMPOL involved in the US, and where politics is very complicated, as you know. I'm hoping that the fear of AI catastrophes is going to bring Republicans and Democrats together, but we'll see.
I think if you, from trying to be as realistic as I can, I think if you could, perhaps after this show, if I may, I'll just send you a brief that information pack, which would give you a brief outline. Also, and if you could just bear it in mind, Yoshua, because I think there may come a time in these negotiations where some kind of common understanding of a common neutral framework is needed. That isn't real, that it doesn't come from any particular nation state, but has the capacity to accommodate all nation states.
Yeah.
Also, Joshua, I think this needs to be clarified because I think John is very specific on that, and I think there's a misunderstanding here. This isn't just targeted at democratic nations. SIMPOL doesn't distinguish between, sort of authoritarian or whatever. So if you were to use SIMPOL, the SIMPOL framework, say in the context of China and the US, then you could easily have Chinese officials sign up to the SIMPOL pledge in the same way as you would have, German or British or Canadian parliamentarians sign up to it. The issue here is that somebody in China will make the laws, and if they sign up, doesn't matter whether they're democratically elected or not, they would be putting their name to the pledge. And I think that is the key issue here, not whether this has a democratic mandate behind it.
Yeah, so basically in democratic countries, it would be the SIMPOL supporters via their SIMPOL, national SIMPOL organizations, together with experts who have the primary power in terms of policy development, right? But in non-democratic countries, it would be the government, those governments. And of course, eventually there then needs to be a negotiation between all of them to see if something can be thrashed out. But anyway, all of that is, the point that Nico's making is that SIMPOL it's not about necessarily primarily about democracy. It's primarily about international cooperation, regardless of how we get there.
Yeah.
And the document I'll send you will clarify that, I think.
No, but I think the general idea of simultaneous implementation and potentially linking multiple issues that you presented, John, is something that could be very important here. So thanks for explaining all these things to me.
Yeah, well, I very much appreciate you having the opportunity, and thank you, Nico, thank you, Yoshua, for that.
Yeah, well, thank you both for, I think this is a very good point to wrap up. Thank you both very much for coming. I think this has been, what we've seen here is that there is a very, very complex, multi-layered, multi-dimensional, multi-perspectival problem, which for a layperson like myself is very hard to actually, to somehow to capture, but in the hands of somebody like Joshua, it all of a sudden becomes manageable. So I think there is clearly, one of the points you made very forcefully is that there needs to be more research, which obviously is about generating more knowledge, but also about communicating that knowledge in a very simple and understandable way to policymakers, so that it does become a sort of something that can be regulated and understood. And of course, but bringing that together with a very sort of like real world pragmatic and approach and project of the kind that John has developed in the last 20 years, you can see how obviously, it's a bit like kind of trying to implant something into an organism. It'll initially be rejected until it kind of finds a way of sort of coming together, if it ever is. But I think it's very interesting to see that there is this policy environment out there on the one hand, and then there's a set of issues on the other, and somehow to bring those two together can be a really, really definitely a very difficult task indeed. But Joshua, I think you are at a very, very interesting sort of place here. You've got a very important role to play, and hopefully I wish you a good hand with the Senate next week. I think I just hope they're all going to listen to you, as attentively as John and I have, because I think they will learn an awful lot, and hopefully we will be able to find a way forward in this very difficult area. Thank you both. Thank you ever so much, and best of luck. Thanks for coming on to Reboot 2030 today. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, Yoshua. Bye.